On December 14, 1799, George Washington, the first president of the United States and a towering figure in American and world history, passed away at his beloved Mount Vernon estate. His death marked the end of an era, prompting an outpouring of grief that resonated throughout the fledgling nation. The passing of George Washington was not only a moment of profound sorrow, but also a powerful testament to the respect and the admiration that the American people held for its founding father. While we're fortunate that the record has passed us a great deal of detail about the president's last moments, the precise cause of Washington's death remains a subject of some discussion among historians and medical professionals. But the commonly accepted series of events attributes Washington's demise to a bacterial affliction, possibly exacerbated by poor weather and cold temperatures. 2 days before his death, on December 12, 1799, Washington went riding his estate on horseback, surveying his lands in cold, wet weather. He returned home late, drenched and chilled, but chose not to change out of his wet clothes immediately, as not to keep his dinner guest waiting. The following day he developed a sore throat and began to show symptoms of respiratory distress. 2 days later, on December 14th, his condition had deteriorated significantly. He experienced difficulty breathing, a high fever, and a deepening hoarseness of his voice. A first-hand account of Washington's last moments comes down to us from an account of his personal secretary, Tobias Lear. The faithful friend of the president recorded his harrowing experience at Washington's deathbed in his diary. Lear wrote, "The general rode out to his farms about 10 o'clock and did not return home until past 3. Soon after he went out, the weather became very bad, rain, hail, and snow falling alternately, with a cold wind. I observed to him that I was afraid that he had gotten wet, and he said no. His greatcoat had kept him dry, but his neck appeared to be wet, and the snow was hanging upon his hair. He came to dinner, which had been waiting for him, without changing his dress, and in the evening he appeared as well as usual." Lear continued his account the following day. "A heavy fall of snow took place on Friday, which prevented the general from riding out as usual. He had taken cold, undoubtedly from being so exposed the day before, and complained of a sore throat. He, however, went out in the afternoon into the ground between the house and the river to mark some trees which were to be cut down in the improvement of the spot. He had a hoarseness which increased in the evening, but he made light of it. That evening the papers were brought in from the post office, and he sat in the parlor with Mrs. Washington and myself reading them until about 9 o'clock. He was very cheerful, and when he was met with anything interesting or entertaining, he would read it aloud as well as his hoarseness would permit him." Lear continued, "Between 2 and 3 o'clock on Saturday morning, he awoke Mrs. Washington and told her that he was very unwell and had an ague. She observed that he could scarcely speak and breathed with difficulty, and would have gotten up to call a servant, but he would not permit her, lest she could take a cold. As soon as day appeared, a woman went into the room to make a fire, and Mrs. Washington sent her immediately to call me. I got up and put on my clothes as quickly as possible and went into his chambers. Mrs. Washington was then up and related to me his being taken ill as before stated. I found the general breathing with difficulty and hardly able to utter a word intelligibly. He desired that Mr. Rawlings, one of the overseers, might be sent to bleed him before the doctors could arrive. I dispatched a servant instantly for Rawlings and another for Dr. Craik, and returned to the general's chambers, where I found him in the same situation as I had left him. A mixture of molasses, vinegar, and butter was prepared to try its effects in the throat, but he could not swallow a drop. Whenever he attempted it, he appeared to be distressed, convulsed, and almost suffocated. Rawlings came in soon after sunrise and prepared to bleed him. When the arm was ready, the general, observing that Rawlings appeared to be agitated, said, as well as he could speak, "Don't be afraid." After the incision was made, he observed, "The orifice is not large enough. However, the blood ran pretty freely." Mrs. Washington, not knowing whether bleeding was proper or not in the general's situation, begged that much might not be taken from him, lest it should be injurious, and desired me to stop it. But when I was about to untie the string, the general put up his hand to prevent it, and as soon as he could speak, said, "More, more." Mrs. Washington, still being very uneasy lest too much blood be taken. Washington's doctors continued their efforts to treat the general over the next several hours with little effect. Lear continued his narrative. About 4:30 o'clock he desired me to call Mrs. Washington to his bedside, when he requested her to go down to his room and take from his desk 2 wills which she would find there, and bring them to him, which she did. Upon looking at them, he gave her one, which he observed that was useless, and being superseded by the other, he desired her to burn it, which she did, and took the other and put it in her closet. After this was done, I returned to his bedside and took his hand. He said to me, "I find I am going. Have me decently buried, and do not let my body be put into a vault in less than 3 days after I am dead." I bowed assent, for I could not speak. He then looked at me again and said, "Do you understand me?" I replied, "Yes." "'Tis well," said he. About 10 minutes before he expired, which was between 10 and 11 o'clock, his breathing became easier. He lay quietly. He withdrew his hand from mine and felt his own pulse. I saw his countenance change. I spoke to Dr. Craik, who sat by the fire. He came to the bedside. The general's hand fell from his wrist. I took it in mine and put it to my bosom. Dr. Craik put his hands over his eyes, and he expired without a struggle or a sigh. While we were fixated in silent grief, Mrs. Washington, who was sitting at the foot of the bed, asked with a firm and collected tone, "Is he gone?" I could not speak, but I held up my hand as a signal that he was no more. "'Tis well," she said in the same voice. "All is over now. I shall soon follow him. I have no more trials to pass through." Given the symptoms described in the historical accounts, many doctors believe that George Washington died from a severe case of epiglottitis, a bacterial infection of the upper throat. Epiglottitis can block the flow of air to the lungs and can be life-threatening, especially if not treated promptly with modern interventions like intubation or antibiotics, neither of which was available in Washington's time. While the exact cause remains a subject of debate, what is clear is that Washington's death was sudden and unexpected, marking the end of a remarkable life and leaving the entire nation in mourning. The gravity of Washington's passing was immediately felt. Local newspapers swiftly spread the news describing his death as an incalculable loss to the country. Many towns and cities across the nation held their own memorial services and eulogies, echoing sentiments of despair and reverence. This widespread mourning underscored Washington's unparalleled position in the American psyche. Held on December 18, 1799, just 4 days after his death, Washington's funeral was a private ceremony attended by family, close friends, and local citizens at Mount Vernon. It was deliberately kept low-key in keeping with Washington's known preference for modesty and simplicity. However, the simplicity did not detract from the solemnity of the occasion. The funeral procession itself was led by 2 military companies and accompanied by mournful music. Washington's pallbearers, a reflection of his diverse roles in American life, included his former military aides, members of the local Masonic Lodge, and his close neighbors. The Reverend Thomas Davis delivered the funeral oration, paying tribute to Washington's unmatched service to the nation, both as a military leader and its first president. Washington's coffin, made of mahogany and adorned with a simple inscription of his name and the date of his death, was placed in the family vault at Mount Vernon as he wished. A notable absence at the funeral was Martha Washington, who, overcome by grief, remained in the mansion. Her heartbreak was shared by many who viewed Washington not just as a political leader and military leader, but as an embodiment of America's ideals and aspirations. In the weeks and months that followed, Congress commissioned a marble monument to be erected in the Capitol, a project that would evolve into the Washington Monument, which stands today in the nation's capital as an enduring symbol of the reverence that Americans hold for their founding father. It's difficult to overstate the profound sense of loss felt by Americans at Washington's death. As a military leader, statesman, and as a symbol of American virtues, Washington's passing was not just the death of a president, it was the end of an era. The mourning that swept the nation underscored the foundational role he played in shaping the United States, a legacy that continues to be celebrated today. Thanks for watching this episode of Powderhorn History. If you enjoyed, please consider subscribing and hitting the like button. Thank you.